Good evening. My name is Hannah Langhoff, and I'm a member of 350 Chicago, an affiliate chapter of 350.org. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit 501c3 organization dedicated to fighting for climate justice and educating Chicagoans, Illinoisans, and people across the country about the climate crisis. If you'd like to get involved, follow our activities, or volunteer with our organization, you can visit us at 350chicago.org. And there you can sign up to receive emails about our work and future speaker events and to receive our newsletter. If you'd like to support our work, you can provide us with a monetary gift to help pay for the cost of producing the speaker series. So tonight, we're proud to bring you the next presenter in our monthly speaker series. The talk will be given by scholar Dr. John Cook, who holds a PhD in cognitive science, is a senior research fellow at the Melbourne Centre for Behaviour Change at the University of Melbourne. He's also a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, and he founded the website Skeptical Science. So without further ado, here is Dr. John Cook.
Thanks very much, Hannah, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I appreciate the opportunity. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of my and other people's research into climate misinformation, understanding it better and how to spot it better, and our efforts to try to help the public be able to spot misinformation and basically be less vulnerable to being misled. Now, I'm going to begin by just giving a brief overview of the climate misinformation landscape. And it helps to understand the landscape if you're going to try to navigate your way through it. And in 2021, I published a research paper with some colleagues from the UK, from the University of Exeter and Trinity College Dublin. What we were aiming to do was train a machine learning model to detect climate misinformation. But before we could do that, we had to build a taxonomy of all the different climate myths, all the different claims found in climate misinformation. And so we built this taxonomy. This is a simplified version of it. It's actually a bit, there's a lot more to it than this, but if I try to put everything in one screen, the text gets so tiny that it's hard to read. But the important thing to recognize is that across climate misinformation, there are 5 main categories. The first 3 categories are, I'll put in air quotes, science-based. They're arguments that either global warming is not happening, it's not caused by us, or the impacts from climate change aren't going to be that bad. The 4th category of climate misinformation is that climate solutions won't work. So that might be criticizing climate policy or criticizing renewables. And the 5th category is attacking climate science, whether it's attacking the science itself, such as climate data, temperature records, climate models, or attacking people, attacking climate scientists or suggesting conspiracy theories. So these are the 5 main categories of climate misinformation. Once we had trained our model to detect these 5 different categories, we then plugged 20 years of climate misinformation into our model in order to build a 2-decade history of climate misinformation. And this is what the last 20 years of climate misinformation looks like. The first thing that really surprised us, well, surprised me at least, was that the first 3 categories, it's not happening, it's not us, it's not bad. These were actually the least prominent categories of climate misinformation. It surprised me because I've spent most of my time on skeptical science and just generally debunking these 3 categories of misinformation, just debunking myths about whether global warming is real or whether it's human caused. But the 5th category, the orange line in this graph, is a much more prominent category of climate misinformation. There's much more attacks on climate science and trying to undermine public trust in climate science rather than making actual scientific arguments. And the other big trend that came out of this research was the black line, this steady transition away from the science arguments and to solutions-based arguments. So you could consider this kind of like making a strategic retreat. As the science of climate change became more concrete, more robust, just harder to deny, people who dismissed climate change then made the strategic retreat to attacking solutions rather than attacking the science. That said, attacking the science is still quite prominent. And to illustrate that, I'll move on to another study that we had published earlier this year, where we had our machine learning model that can detect all the different climate misinformation claims. We then applied that model to Twitter misinformation. So we fed millions of climate tweets into our model in order to build a history of climate misinformation on Twitter. And this is what we found from climate misinformation tweets. These are the most common categories of climate misinformation tweets, and 40% of the climate misinformation on Twitter was attacking scientists. So it was actually ad hominem attacks against climate scientists. Another 20%, the second biggest category, was conspiracy theories. So 60% of climate misinformation on Twitter is either conspiracy theories or ad hominem attacks. In other words, again, trying to undermine public trust in climate science. And just those two categories are more than all the other categories combined. So it just really underscores two things. Firstly, climate misinformation does look different depending on the platform. On Twitter, it's actually a lot more feral, I would characterize, compared to back here when we were looking at conservative think tank websites. And also, climate misinformation is more about undermining public trust in climate science rather than trying to make consistent arguments, proposing their own explanations of what's happening in the world. So given this prevalence of climate misinformation, most of my research as someone with a psychology background has been how can we build public resilience against misinformation? In other words, how can we fine-tune people's BS detectors and help them spot misinformation? In the psychology world, we call this approach logic-based inoculation. So it's logic-based, it's teaching people how to spot logical fallacies, and inoculation is a branch of psychological research which takes the idea of vaccination, where you expose people to a weakened version of a virus in order to build up their immunity against the actual virus. But you can take that idea and apply it to knowledge. If you expose people to a weakened version of misinformation, that builds up their cognitive immunity, so they're less likely to be misled when they encounter actual misinformation. In 2017, I published my first study into this approach, where we tried basically building people's BS detectors or strengthening them. And what we did was we ran an experiment. In our experiment, we had our participants and we randomly divided them up into two groups. One group was shown just some misinformation. And this is the misinformation that we showed people. This was actually taken verbatim from the website Global Warming Petition Project, which features a list of 31,000 science graduates from the US who've signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. What we found was when people were shown just this climate misinformation, it had a negative effect. It reduced people's climate perceptions. And this graph here shows how climate perceptions went down. Anything below the dotted line is negative. It's pulling or reducing people's perceptions about the scientific consensus on climate change. The horizontal axis in this graph is political ideology. So people on the right are more right-wing, people on the left are more left-wing. And what we found in this experiment was basically climate misinformation didn't have the same effect on everyone, people who were more politically conservative were more affected or influenced by the misinformation, whereas people on the political left were less or not at all affected by the misinformation. And this tells us that climate misinformation has a polarizing effect. It pulls people apart. So after the public are exposed to climate misinformation, people have further, their beliefs about climate change have moved further apart, and the public has become more polarized. The second group in our experiment was shown this inoculation message before they were shown the climate misinformation. And the interesting thing about our inoculation message was it didn't mention the global warming petition project at all. It didn't have any specific mention about them. Instead, what it did was it spoke in general terms about a technique used to mislead called fake experts. Fake experts is a strategy where you use people who convey the impression of expertise, but they don't actually have the relevant expertise. And the Global Warming Petition Project has many fake experts. Amongst the 31,000 signatories of the petition, more than 99% of them don't have expertise in climate change. They're anyone with a science degree. So their degree might be in computer science or veterinary science or medical science or engineering, but hardly any had any actual expertise in climate change. This is what we found happened when people were shown the inoculation message explaining the fake expert technique, then shown the misinformation, the blue line here. And while the blue line has a slight slope to it, statistically it's equivalent to a flat line. The misinformation was neutralized across the political spectrum. In other words, whether people are left-wing or right-wing, whether they're liberal or conservative, nobody likes being misled. And when you explain the techniques used to mislead, those techniques no longer work. The other thing that this research showed us was you can neutralize misinformation without even mentioning it by explaining the technique used to mislead. If I go back to the example, the inoculation message, the example we used was actually tobacco misinformation from the mid-20th century. There's that very madman looking newspaper ad there. We found that in inoculating people against tobacco misinformation then had the effect of also neutralizing climate misinformation. So this tells us that by explaining the techniques of misinformation, by improving people's BS detectors, you can inoculate people against misinformation or neutralize misinformation across topics, because we see these same misleading techniques being used across different topics, in all topics, really. So that means that the key to improving people's BS detectors is explaining the techniques used to mislead. And I found a useful framework for doing this is the FLIC framework, which stands for the 5 techniques of science denial: fake experts, which we just looked at, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. The challenge, though, is that these aren't just techniques, these 5 techniques, they're actually categories. And there are a whole range of different techniques using fake experts. There are a range of logical fallacies and other rhetorical techniques and even traits of conspiratorial thinking. And so this whole taxonomy of this FLIC taxonomy of misleading techniques it summarizes all the different ways that people can be misled, but it's also quite a big taxonomy, and this is not comprehensive either. There are other techniques as well and I continue to build up this taxonomy. So that's a challenge which I will come back to shortly. Now, after I finished this research in 2017, this inoculation experiment, the next question in my mind was, well, how practically do you identify misleading techniques in misinformation? Um, what's a reliable way to take a claim and then identify, well, what is the fallacy in there? So then I can explain that to other people. And to answer that question, I teamed up with a couple of professional BS detectors. In other words, two critical thinking philosophers, Peter Allerton and David Kincaid. And we worked together to develop a step-by-step way to identify fallacies in misinformation. And let me give you a brief explanation of how you do that. But also, in the top right here, there is a little link, sks.to/cafe. If you go to that link, it's just a short 3-minute YouTube video where we summarize this research and summarize how you can deconstruct misinformation to identify fallacies and misleading techniques. But let me give you an example now. Let's take an example from 2016. Back then, 2016, so 8 years ago, it feels like a lifetime ago, really. But during the Republican primaries, Senator Marco Rubio, who we've just learned this week is probably going to be the Secretary of State in the new administration, he made this argument when asked a question about climate change. He said that the reason why climate is changing is because climate has always been changing. Now, you might see a statement like this and think, that doesn't seem quite right. There's something there that's a bit off, but I'm not sure what. And so when you encounter a statement like that where you think it might be misinformation, but you're not sure whether it is, and if it is misinformation, you're not sure how it's misleading, why is it wrong? This step-by-step critical thinking approach is a way to dig deeper into an argument. And there are 3 steps to deconstructing and analyzing misinformation. Step 1 is you deconstruct the argument or the claim into an argument structure. Now, an argument consists of premises or starting assumptions leading to a conclusion. In the case of Rubio's claim, there are basically 2 premises. The first premise is that climate has changed naturally in the past, and the second premise is that climate is currently changing. The conclusion is that current climate change must be naturally caused. Now, the second step in this process is identifying, are there any hidden premises or unstated assumptions in this argument? And we've done analysis elsewhere where we found that more than 90% of climate misinformation arguments contain hidden premises or unstated assumptions. In this case, the hidden premise is that whatever was driving climate change in the past must be the same as what's driving climate change now. I'm kind of sort of glossing over some of the details in our flowchart, but please feel free to watch that video and even read our paper to go into greater detail. The third step is you go through each of these premises, P1, P2, and the hidden premise, and you look for any logical fallacies or misleading rhetorical techniques. In this case, the first premise is true. Climate has changed in the past, naturally. The second premise is true. Climate is currently changing. But the third premise, the hidden premise, commits the fallacy of single cause. It assumes that there's only one factor driving climate change, natural causes, when there can be other factors such as human activity. And so this critical thinking approach is a reliable way to surgically identify if a claim is misinformation and exactly how does it mislead people. Now, while I was doing this work with these critical thinking philosophers, they introduced me to a communication technique, which I found quite intriguing. They call it parallel argumentation. It's also called logic analogies. Basically, if you want to explain how something is misleading, you take the flawed logic in the misinformation and you transplant it into a parallel situation or an analogy, an analogical situation, and use the same flawed logic. And the more absurd, the more extreme your parallel example, the clearer and more concrete it is for people to see the original flawed logic. And it so happens that before I did my PhD in cognitive psychology, I was a cartoonist for a living. And I realized that cartoons and humor were actually the perfect delivery mechanism for parallel arguments explaining misinformation. So I did some more research with some communication experts at George Mason University on this humorous approach to explaining fallacies. And we found that using humor to explain misinformation fallacies held people's attention for longer, and people were more likely to share it, interact with it if it was on social media. So it was quite a sticky, attention-grabbing way to explain misinformation. So let me give you some examples of what I mean. Here is the original misinformation claim from Marco Rubio. And the logic of what he's saying is the reason why climate is changing is because climate has always been changing. That logic is exactly the same as the parallel situation where someone finds a dead body with a knife sticking out of their back and saying, well, this person must have died of natural causes because people have always died of natural causes. It's single cause fallacy. It's, assuming there can only be that one cause when there are actually other multiple causes. And using this parallel argument is a way to make the initial fallacy, the initial bad logic in the misinformation clearer and more obvious to people. And it also happens to be an entertaining way to explain how an argument is wrong. You'll find that late night comedians use this technique all the time. They'll be debunking some misinformation that someone has said that day, and they'll say, well, this person made this argument. That's just like being in this situation. And then they have a parallel situation and they use the same logic. Everyone laughs, it's funny, it's entertaining, but it also explains how the original argument was misleading. Let me give you another example. In 2014, I think it was, maybe it was 2015 actually, because 2014 was the hottest year on record. And then in February 2015, Senator Inhofe in Congress argued that, well, it's not really the hottest year on record because here's a snowball. That logic is exactly the same logic as arguing that because it's dark at nighttime, that proves that the sun doesn't exist. It's using anecdote fallacy, only looking at what my immediate circumstance is at that time and place while ignoring the broader picture. I'll give you one more example. And this is kind of cutting a bit close to the bone. This was a quote from 2017, the day after the US pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm feeling a bit deja vu because it looks like we're probably going to be going through exactly the same process again in just a few months. But one of the justifications for pulling out of the climate agreement from Scott Pruitt, who was the head of the EPA at the time, was that global warming has stopped. And saying, well, if we just look at the last decade or so, global warming has been in a hiatus. I mean, it wasn't even statistically true because, as this showed, 2014 was the hottest year on record. But anyway, that was the argument that was being made, and it was the argument that global warming stopped in 1998 was a common argument for about a decade. But that argument commits the fallacy of cherry picking. It's like being in a sinking ship, and as the bow of the ship rises up, you argue, well, we're not sinking because I'm moving upwards. You're only looking at a short part of the picture and ignoring the full picture. So that's a couple of examples of explaining fallacies in climate misinformation using parallel argumentation or logic analogies. And for the last couple of years, my research has been focused on how can I help people be able to spot all these different fallacies that you see in the Flick taxonomy. Now, the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are a lot of different ways to mislead people. There are a lot of fallacies and rhetorical techniques to mislead. And that's a big communication and education challenge. How do you get people to learn all these techniques and then internalize them deeply enough that they can spot them in the wild, on TV, on social media, in conversation? And thinking about this problem, and also reading the Nobel Prize winning book, or not the book by the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman talks about two different ways of thinking. The first way of thinking, which he calls System 1 thinking or fast thinking, is our instantaneous reactions. And this is actually the vast bulk of our thinking, is fast thinking. We're constantly making instant reactions, emotional reactions, snap judgments, mental shortcuts or heuristics. And that's how we get through the day. That's how our brains are hardwired. The second type of thinking is slow thinking. And this is the more difficult type of thinking. It's an example of slow thinking is critical thinking. That idea of deconstructing misinformation claims in order to identify fallacies. That's slow thinking. It takes time, it's difficult, it takes effort, cognitive effort. And because it's effortful, we don't do as much slow thinking. We mostly do fast thinking. And this is another big psychological hurdle that is in the way of us solving this problem of building up our BS detectors. BS detection is slow thinking. It's difficult. It's effortful. However, in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's kind of buried away in the middle of the book, and people don't talk about it very much. But Kahneman also talks about a third type of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. And what he means by this is the type of thinking when somebody does a difficult task, a slow thinking task, but he or she does it over and over and over again until they're so practiced at it that they can do it quickly, like almost like an effortless reaction. In other words, their slow thinking task becomes fast thinking. Think of a heart surgeon who has performed thousands of heart surgeries so they can look at a very complicated, difficult situation and make instant snap decisions. That's expert heuristics. And so there is the potential to help people become good BS detectors if they can practice critical thinking, practice spotting BS enough that slow thinking task becomes a fast thinking task. But how do you get people practicing critical thinking? To achieve that, I turn to games. The advantage of games is you can use the gameplay elements like collecting points and leveling up to motivate people to practice something over and over again. And so we developed a critical thinking game called Cranky Uncle. The idea of it is that Cranky Uncle is a climate-denying, science-denying Cranky Uncle, someone that seems to be ubiquitous in everyone's lives. We all seem to have an uncle or a family member who thinks that they know better than the world's scientific experts. And what this game does is it goes through all the techniques in the Flick taxonomy, and Cranky Uncle explains each technique. So he basically explains, if you want to be a cranky uncle, you have to use these techniques. You need to cherry pick. You need to use logical fallacies. And he explains how he does each of these different techniques. But really what he's doing is explaining how to spot those techniques. And once you've learnt how each technique works, then the game gets you practicing critical thinking. It shows you examples of misinformation, and you have to identify what is the fallacy in this particular example. And by doing that, the game gets you practicing critical thinking repeatedly, and that difficult, slow thinking task becomes a fast thinking task, being able to detect BS. The other advantage of this approach is because it's all based on critical thinking and logical fallacies, the same fallacies used in climate misinformation are also used in other topics as well. And so because of that, I was approached by UNICEF to take the Cranky Uncle game and develop a vaccine version of the game. We basically use the same approach where a cranky uncle explained the techniques he uses to cast doubt on vaccines, and also a health professional explained facts about vaccines. And also we had people, we had examples of all the different fallacies, and people had to play quiz questions where they spotted the fallacies. So that's the advantage of this critical thinking approach. When you can spot misinformation techniques in one topic, you can spot them in other topics, all topics. And I'll just quickly share with you some results from a pilot study, which is coming out soon, where we measured how good people were at spotting misinformation techniques before the game, the light-coloured bars in this very complicated bar chart, sorry, and after the game, the darker colours. And we found that when people rated vaccine facts, from before the game to after the game, they became more trusting in facts or more agreeing with facts, but also they became less agreeing with vaccine fallacies. And this is exactly the pattern we wanted to see. Belief in facts go up, belief in misinformation goes down. And so this shows that ideally, you can not only build people's BS detectors, spotting misinformation techniques, but also improving their belief in facts as well. And I'll stop there. I think I've been talking for nearly 40 minutes. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions. And I'll also leave you with this slide, which includes URLs to all the different research papers that I mentioned today.